Over the years, one of the most debated topics in vanilla PvP has been burst damage. From Battlegrounds to World PvP, players have always had strong opinions about how quickly fights can turn and whether that level of burst makes for a better or worse experience. But on Vanilla Plus servers, and especially on projects like TurtleWoW, the issue has only grown more noticeable with class changes, improved itemization, and more powerful endgame gear available than in 2005. Burstiness has become a more pressing concern, and the devs have taken notice. Recently, the TurtleWoW team began discussing potential solutions to help tone it down. One idea that surfaced is the reintroduction of resilience, the PvP-specific stat first introduced in the Burning Crusade as a way to reduce crits and dampen burst damage in PvP. But we need to ask an important question here. At what cost? If we bring back resilience, we risk repeating the mistakes that Blizzard made almost 20 years ago. We risk dividing the player base again and pushing the players away from the freedom and openness that made vanilla World of Warcraft so special in the first place. And we also need to remember Blizzard stepped away from PvP-specific stats for a reason, because the downsides started to outweigh the benefits, because it introduced friction into how people played and progressed their characters, and because it made the game less fun and more grindy. So in this video, I want to share my perspective on the resilience debate, what I think it would change, why I believe it might hurt more than help, and most importantly, what I think could be done instead to address burst damage in vanilla PvP without sacrificing the things that make it so enjoyable. Vanilla WoW was never perfect, but it had something that later versions of the game struggled to maintain: freedom. You weren't locked into a specific type of gear based on what content you wanted to do. You could raid in PvP gear if you wanted. You could bring crafted or reputation gear into Battlegrounds. You could throw in some engineering trinkets or even a dungeon blue and still contribute. And more importantly, the best gear wasn't always obvious. You had to experiment, you had to test things, and that gave players ownership over their builds. The game didn't tell you what to wear, you figured it out. And that made the experience feel personal and creative. That open-ended design is what made vanilla feel like a living world, not a checklist simulator. And introducing a PvP-specific stat like resilience directly undermines that sandbox experience. So let's talk about where resilience actually came from: the Burning Crusade. In TBC, player damage started scaling much faster. Arena was introduced, and Blizzard's response was to introduce a brand new stat called resilience, a purely PvP stat that reduced your chance to be crit, reduced crit damage taken, and eventually even reduced dot damage and mana drain. On paper, it was a solution to a real problem, but in practice, it created a much bigger issue: a hard line between PvE and PvP gear. Suddenly, if you didn't have resilience gear, you were at a huge disadvantage in PvP. Even if your raid gear had higher raw stats without resilience, you were getting shredded in Battlegrounds. And conversely, if you farmed a full PvP set, it was often too stat heavy on stamina and resilience to perform well in raids. So players had to maintain two complete gear sets, not because it was fun, but because the system demanded it. And what that did was discourage people from casually dipping into content. You couldn't just hop into a BG after a raid anymore. You had to respec, swap gear, and accept being at a disadvantage if you didn't have the right setup. The biggest problem with resilience wasn't that it was ineffective, it's that it was exclusive. It forced players into a binary mindset. Either you were a PvPer or you were a PvEer. There was no middle ground. This hurt casual players the most. The people who just wanted to enjoy both Battlegrounds and dungeons on the same character. The players who liked experimenting with off-meta builds or swapping roles. Suddenly, the game was telling them, no, you have to grind this entire other gear set first. It also gutted one of Vanilla's greatest joys: gear overlap. The idea that a single piece of gear could be useful in multiple situations. Trinkets like Tidal Charm, Hand of Justice, or even PvE rewarded weapons became less viable when PvP started demanding one specific stat. The game went from what can I do with what I have to what does the system require from me? And for a lot of us, that's where WoW began to lose its magic. Over time, Blizzard tried other PvP-specific systems, PvP power in Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria, and versatility later on. But every time, the result was the same. More friction, more gear segregation, and a more bloated system for players to navigate. Eventually, even the original developers saw that PvP-specific stats added more problems than they solved. And by Legion, Blizzard scrapped the whole idea. Why? Because it was simpler, more accessible, and more fun. Players could jump into PvP without being locked behind a completely separate grind, and the game became more flexible, more welcoming. And that's something Turtle WoW or any Vanilla Plus project should think about before going back to something like Resilience. If Turtle WoW reintroduces Resilience, even with good intentions, here's what I believe they risk. Creating a gear wall where new or casual players can't compete unless they farm a specific PvP set. Discouraging crossover between PvE and PvP, something that Vanilla handled beautifully. Punishing experimentation by making off-meta or hybrid setups less viable. And worst of all, eroding the Vanilla identity, replacing it with something that feels more like TBC or Wrath, not the sandbox-style gameplay we all came here for. This isn't just about stat tuning, this is about the soul of the game. Vanilla works not because it's perfectly balanced, but because it gives you the space to explore, adapt, and find your own way. I'm not saying PvP burst isn't a problem, it absolutely can be, but there are other ways to approach it without bringing back PvP-specific stats. Option 1. A flat damage reduction in player versus player combat. Something like players take 15-25% less damage from other players. Simple and easy to adjust. It doesn't affect gear or PvE in any way. And it's a soft fix, not a full overhaul. This is my personal favorite. I don't see any downside to this. Option 2. A universal damage reduction. Apply an overall damage reduction across the board, not just in PvP, not just for certain abilities. I'm talking about a universal scaling down of player damage output in the game as a whole. The downside is that this would probably be an immense undertaking. Option 3. Increase baseline stamina or health. This gives everyone a little more survivability without requiring stat stacking. Again, it's easy to scale up or down and doesn't hurt Vanilla's itemization. But the downside is that now all mobs and every other PvE encounters need to be adjusted accordingly, so they are still a challenge. All of these options are less invasive than Resilience, and they keep the vanilla feel intact. At the end of the day, this isn't just a conversation about damage numbers, it's about vision. What do we want Vanilla to be? If we want it to be a place where players can play how they want, experiment freely, and jump between content types without friction, then we need to protect that freedom. And reintroducing Resilience might seem like a small change, but it comes with a heavy cost. So my message is simple. Let's fix PvP, but let's do it in a way that respects the Vanilla identity. Because once you start fragmenting the game with layered systems and stat silos, it stops feeling like Vanilla at all. So what do you think? Would Resilience be a step in the right direction? Or is it a relic of a different era that doesn't belong in Vanilla? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, give it a like, maybe subscribe, and share it with your guild or server community. The more people we get involved in the conversation, the better Turtle WoW and Classic Plus in general can become. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe if you want to see more Turtle and Classic Plus content. and I'll see you in the next one.